Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Chisom Ifobu, and I am a second-year PhD student studying geotechnical engineering, and I'm also one of the Ask You Camp coaches, and I'll be presenting the first half of this general session that is on the PhD proposal, writing the PhD proposal. So this is the outline of our presentation. We're going to briefly tell you what the research proposal is, structure of your research proposal, the different sections, and then give you a few tips and also reminders for the mentorship program in general and what you should have done by now. And then there'll be a brief Q&A session at the end. So what is the research proposal? So in mostly the PhD proposals, to my knowledge, it's only PhD application, you're asked to provide a research proposal, which should outline the motivation and objectives of the project that you're proposing. That's if you're proposing your project. I think maybe some of you will be applying to studentships or the CDT, which doesn't need you to provide a proposal. But yeah, when you're providing a proposal, you need to outline your motivation objectives and you should tell the reader how you plan to carry out your research in some detail. And keep in mind that they will understand that you don't have all the information, but you should show that you have actually thought it through to some extent at least. So it needs to show that your research is worthwhile. That means that it should have some benefit to society or some contribution to the field that you're working in. So like, for example, you can't, if you want to design like a better method of making this pen per se, if you want to design a manufacturing process for this pen, but the manufacturing process you propose doesn't make the pen cheaper, it makes it more expensive, or it doesn't make it like more sustainable, then that like research isn't worthwhile because you're not really contributing anything. You're just making the same pen, but in a more difficult and more expensive and a worse way for the environment. So no one wants that kind of research. You also want your research to be feasible in 3 to 4 years. So when you come to Cambridge, they want you to finish your PhD at most 4 years. It could depend, but ideally you want to propose a project that you can finish within a time frame. So you can't have, for example, you can't be studying like maybe genetically modifying a plant, but it requires that your plant requires like 5 years to grow. You can't finish doing that project in 3 years. So like that's automatically rejection because there's no way you can finish project in 3 years. And it also needs to be executable at Cambridge. So for example, in my course, I'm doing geotechnical engineering, and one of the major like equipments I use in my research is called a geotechnical centrifuge, which basically just applies an enhanced gravity field on soil so that you can look at a model of soil as if it's the actual, like you can look at a model of a soil and a building as if it's the actual like full-scale building, even though it's 100 times smaller, for example. And there are only like 4 of these centrifuges in the UK. So if, for example, you wanted to apply not to Cambridge, but to Imperial College, and you said, oh, I'm looking at this like innovative like design for a foundation of a building, and I want to do a lot of like centrifuge tests and centrifuge modeling. And Imperial says, well, we don't have a centrifuge, so we can't really take you because you can't do that project here. You need to make sure that the project you're doing, Cambridge has the facilities to help you do that project. So if you need something for your project, you need to make sure that it's actually available in Cambridge. So you need to research like at your department or different departments because there can be cross-disciplinary work and see like what facilities are available in Cambridge and you can tie your research to them. So a brief overview of the structure of your research proposal. You need to give a title of your project, and it doesn't need to be anything fancy. It just needs to tell like the person reading it that's what your project is about, essentially. Then you give an introduction or context, like why is your project important? Why are you looking at this problem? For example, I'm looking at redesigning onshore wind turbine foundations. So a kind of introduction or context is the electricity access in Africa. Most of the people without electricity access are in Africa, so there's an energy deficit, and you can expand on that as your context. You also want to give well, depending on the course, it could be a literature review or state of the arts. Literature review as in what research have other researchers done in this field. State of the art, what is the current design practice or current manufacturing practice if you're in STEM field, or related work, what have other people developed that you want to improve upon or you want to base your research on, or what experimental techniques have people used that I think could be useful in your research, or even some preliminary data. Some of you can have research experience already, so you're just basing your project on your previous work, so you can provide some preliminary data that provides the basis for this project that you're applying for. And I've grouped these two sections into what I call background and motivation. You can do that, or you can make them separate. You also have your statement of research question, research contribution, hypothesis. That's just what specifically you're trying to specifically what you're trying to find out in your project. You have your broad context, but you want to narrow it down to get to frame your research question. And then based on these research questions, you then get your research objectives, which are basically trying to answer your research question. The research objectives will tell you whether you can say your project was successful or not. Well, there's no such thing as an unsuccessful project. You just have things that did not work, which are useful to other people. But it gives you a kind of metric to measure your progress along your PhD. Then the research plan and methodology. You also want to put a lot of detail into this. Like I said, you need to show them that it's possible to be done at Cambridge. I need to show them that you've thought through these processes. And references, if you're giving your a review of the research done already or your related work or all these things in the state of the art, you need to reference your sources and make sure that it's formatted properly at the end of your research proposal. So on background and motivation, basically you're meant to provide what is the problem, why do we care, and what is the current practice. So I'm just going to play a short clip on YouTube that quickly gives you each point. It's really short, 30 seconds, if it works.
Bananas are one of the world's most wasted crops. These giant stems are part of the crop. Typically burn them, but that pollutes the air. So instead, one company in Uganda has figured out how to pulverize them into fiber to make rugs, placemats, even hair extensions. So could bananas become a great alternative to cotton or silk? Announcements empowered.
So in this clip, they've told us what the problem is, and the problem is bananas produce a lot of waste during their production. And they told us current practice, which is to burn the waste from the banana. And we should care about that because that causes air pollution, which leads to global warming and also other diseases as well, and which increases the problem of climate change that we're facing. So that's a quick summary of what your background and motivation could be, but you need to flesh it out because you're not making a video, you're writing a proposal. So I just wanted to give you a quick and kind of entertaining example that drives home the point of your background and motivation. So your research questions and objectives should go hand in hand and mirror each other, and they should specify the scope of your research. So you have this big problem that you're trying to, you're interested in but you cannot solve every aspect of that problem. You can just take little bits and just focus on those bits. And then you frame your research question, and then you outline your objectives based on those research questions. So completely unrelated. Imagine that. So this project was interested in looking at using seaweed to reduce the scour around monopile foundations on offshore wind turbines. So scour is just the erosion of the soil around the monopile, and the monopile is just a tube that is driven into the soil, and then you build the wind turbine on top of it. But it's offshore, so the tube, the base of the monopile is underwater. And as the water beneath the surface flows around the monopile, it erodes the soil. So you're looking at using seaweed, planting seaweed around the base of the monopile to prevent the soil from being washed away. So a research question that the person is interested in is, what species of seaweed best suit our application? So how are we going to do that? What are objectives? You need to do that, you need to search for, select, grow, and characterize a suitable seaweed species. Another research question is, can seaweed actually mitigate scarring around a monopile foundation? Well, first of all, you need to understand how scarring around the foundation actually happens and how it occurs. And then you can look at, okay, what's the effect of adding seaweed versus not adding seaweed around the foundation? On to the research planning methodology. This is where you say how you're going to achieve these objectives. So you need to state what equipment you will need. If it's like based on big data analysis, you need to say what data you need, how you're going to access that data. If you're like looking at records or documents, you need to say like what they are specifically, where you're going to get them from. Do you need to contact a library outside of Cambridge, and you want Cambridge to help you do the exchange with the library? Or if you're like in STEM or mathematics or computing, you need to specify what softwares or tools you're going to be using. Or in the humanities, you may want to interview participants. You can say, what's the profile of participants you're going to interview, or the kind of survey you're going to do. Or you might need to travel to a whole other country to do some field work. You could specify that as well. And you can also give a rough timeline so that they can know that, okay, this person is aware that they need to finish this in 3 to 4 years, and they have thought of how to do that to some extent. So let's take, for example, the objective of choosing a suitable species of seaweed. We have 3, these are just random pictures I got online. I don't really know what they are, but 3 species examples, and you're trying to get that first objective of choosing a suitable species of seaweed. So you could specify how many you would look at. You could extend the range of seaweed you're going to look at, and where would you get them? Like you're not essentially not going to buy them from a supermarket or something. You're probably going to grow them on your own. So where will you grow them, and when will you grow? Where and when would you grow them? How long does it take for them to grow? Are there facilities in Cambridge that can help you, that do research in seaweed and can help you grow them, or you can grow them in those facilities? And why did you choose these specific species? So you could say, because the depth of water is 20 meters, and these seaweeds can grow to like 10 meters. They can grow at depths of 20 meters and grow to like 10 meters. So they're able to survive in this environment. So that's something that you can talk about, give those specifics in your research plan. Okay, so this is all to Maisha.
Hi, I'm Maisha. I am a second-year PhD in History and Philosophy of Science, and I co-chair the mentorship program with Chisholm. So I'm going to switch to talking about similar questions that just raised, but more in the social sciences. And folks who are in the humanities, especially if your work is a bit more on the like quantitative side, can take some tips from here as well. But I think most of us that aren't in the engineering or science spaces are actually in social sciences. So we want to follow very similar principles. You need to specify the scope of your research, but also whatever objectives you outline should lead you back, should be directly connected to your research questions. So if you outline a clear objective, your research question should be the smaller steps or the smaller areas you should be considering in order for you to ultimately achieve that objective. And so in this example, there's a list of research questions, which typically in the social sciences, it's okay to have a number of research questions that you're thinking about. They should be interrelated, but they should also kind of build on each other. And so it should tell a full story of the types of problems or the tensions that you're going to be looking at in your work. And so this one's like relatively broad. How has Africa been used as a testing ground for privacy, surveillance, and artificial intelligence digital technologies? This is, pretty broad at the onset. Africa is a large continent, has 54 countries within it. If you're considering doing work on the continent, you would find it advantageous to think about specific regions, whether you want to choose East and focus on countries there, or maybe you want to do a comparative study. So you might do maybe Kenya and Ghana, for example, but you want to be specific about that space so that they understand that your project is actually feasible. Because if you're trying to take this topic from across the entire continent, you're not going to come to a complete answer in 4 years. But if you narrow that scope, or if you think a bit more critically about particular communities that you can consider, then that allows you to have a more feasible project. So that might be narrowing the scope to a particular country, or maybe a small cluster of countries, 2 or 3. Or it might mean choosing just one of these areas. Maybe it's just privacy and not surveillance and AI. Moving on to the next question, what are the unique cultural contexts influencing a country's development of policies related to data privacy, surveillance, and artificial intelligence? So this kind of lets them know that, okay, you're going to be considering this idea of whatever country you choose as a testing ground, but what sort of other context are you going to be considering? What sort of other questions or what type of lens are you taking when you're looking at this country as a testing ground? And that might be a cultural lens, it might be economic, it might be more on the side of like technological development, which still kind of has like a socioeconomic perspective. You might take it from a political perspective. There are a bunch of different lenses you can look at, but specifying what that lens is helpful as well. And then for the last one, or the last two actually, what are the consequences of these policies for citizen engagement with digital technologies? And so now you're getting into, okay, you want to understand how, what you want to describe what this use is, because you're asking the question how. You want to take the lens of culture, because that's the unique context you're talking about. And then you also want to investigate what those implications are, what those consequences are from a policy-based standpoint. And then finally, still carrying on with that policy, how does the presence or absence of these policies influence citizen perspectives of these digital technologies? And so when you look at this set of questions, which kind of contribute to a larger research question, you can see how you start off from, okay, there's the use of this country as a testing ground. Then there's some cultural context that we'll look at within this country. Okay, then we'll look at the consequences or the implication for those policies. And then we want to understand the absence or presence of these policies on citizen perspectives. So while these are distinct questions, they build on each other, and you need to answer all of them to have a complete picture, if that makes sense. And on the right side, you see the kind of objectives. It's investigating the histories of data privacy, surveillance, and artificial intelligence. And then again, you would want to specify which particular countries you're interested in. But you would also want to provide some context for why you're interested in those countries as well. And then finally, this idea of like who is active or who is passive in terms of using those technologies is another objective. And collectively, those questions help to address those objectives. Next slide. So if we take another look in terms of research plan and methodology, which might be something new for folks if you don't have a lot of like research experience, or if you haven't had to lead a research project on your own. Sometimes when you come into a research project, you don't have to set the research plan, you don't have to set the methodology. There's probably a smaller defined piece of work that you're going to contribute to that project. When you're doing your PhD, sure, you might be working in someone's lab or you might have your supervisor, but the bulk of your work is going to be you setting, what you want to study, having a clear plan for doing that, doing the research and reading you need to have a good background for that, determining what other like resources you need to carry out your project, but also in partnership with your supervisor, but also after like reading articles and seeing what their methodologies are, defining what your methodology is. And so on the right, it's just the objectives restated. But on the left, we'll think about questions that are important to consider or aspects that are important to consider for the research plan and the methodology. So for the research plan, how are you going to achieve your objectives? It's nice to have a really cool question that you're interested in investigating, but at the end of the day, you need to produce a dissertation. And in order to produce that dissertation, you need to know how are you going to get from the start, which is essentially your proposal, to the actual dissertation, which is your finish line. And so coming up with a plan helps you to do that. And so when you're thinking about that plan, especially in the social sciences, you need to consider things like ethics approval. Maybe you're doing interviews or observations in a setting where there are children. There are very clear kind of like ethical guidelines for that and ways you have to navigate around like protecting the kids while perhaps maintaining some anonymity, but also just making sure that's approved by the body that governs research, like here in the UK. And perhaps like in the place where you're doing your research as well. So going through ethics approvals will be like really important, but also something that your department can help with as well. Thinking about data sets, is there a data set that's out there that you'll need to have access to, that you'll need to use? Where are you going to get the information that you're looking for? And so it's like your job to be able to tell them you're going to have these research questions and objectives, but also let them know what resources are out there that you need to have access to in order to be able to carry out that project. So if you're doing a project that is related to out of school youth, you're probably going to be looking at some data sets related to youth education from organizations that can give you ideas about demographics of youth populations in whatever countries you're looking at. That can tell you maybe questions about how much funding goes into education, or what percentage of someone's income goes towards their child's education, or at what age children usually drop out of school, like different questions like that. Like people are already doing pretty extensive research, so you need to be able to like helpfully ground your research in that space as well. If you're on the history side, and sometimes in the social science, in like the sociology side as well, a lot of times you have to look at archives. And so there are probably some documents, whether it's like primary sources you're looking at for, someone who might have like originally like written it. Maybe you are like, in my case, I'm in history and philosophy of science, and part of my like work is looking at some like the original like business documents that tech companies are using in the various countries that I study. So maybe there's some corporate archives that there are corporate archives that I'll be visiting. Maybe there's some other documents related to what the process is for someone to start up a business in these countries. And so I need to be able to access that, whether that's from a like economic body within the country, whether that's publicly available. You should know the answers to these questions in general. But also similar to the points about ethics approval, when you're outlining for like survey or interview participants, you need to be thinking about who you need to talk to, what questions you want to ask them, how you'll actually get them to answer your questions, but also how you aren't kind of like leading your questions, how you're not swaying like their responses. And so those will be things you talk about in your proposal. And also field work. So if you need to leave the university, there are probably a lot of things you need to consider for that, or there are a lot of things you need to consider for that. So when you'll go, what the environment will be like when you go, whether you need to like delay your time for going to that particular country, that particular space, or whether you need to do it sooner. Questions about maybe you need to also have like access to resources that are here in Cambridge. And so how do you make sure like when you're developing your timeline that you can get done what you need to get done in Cambridge, also go and do your field work, and then have everything, you know, collected so that when you start like writing up, you've already gotten the information you need. Something that people forget to talk about are the skill sets that they already have, but also the new ones they need to develop. And so for me, when I was doing like applications for my PhD, but also my master's, especially because a lot of my works can focus in East Africa, but also in the Americas, so like Spanish speaking communities. I talk about like my own language proficiency, like being fluent in whatever language or proficient in this language. I might also talk about gaps in that language, just like, oh, okay, maybe I have proficiency in this language, but I want to take a class that's specifically for researchers in this language, for example. You might also talk about like quantitative skills you have. So like, okay, I have experience doing the data visualization and maybe like Python or querying an XYZ platform. Like if you talk about using data, especially if you're doing maybe mixed methods research or quantitative research, you need to also communicate to them whether you already have that skill set, what sort of like methods you might be using, but also, you know, what opportunities you're already identifying to like fill in that gap. And that might be an example, you know, one example might be looking at, what is it, SSRMP, I think it's called, but it's essentially free courses that the university offers for qualitative and quantitative skills. So for me, someone who's coming from more of a I guess I would say computational social science background who might not have, I don't have like strong experience in ethnography. I'm taking a class in ethnography because I know that'll be part of like my research. And so that's on like the qualitative side. So I think collectively identifying the skills like you do have that'll be beneficial for your research so that they know, you know, you're not starting from ground zero. There's already like a background for you. And then also acknowledging the skills you need to gain or improve on and how you're going to do that. And then lastly, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this timeline, it should be reasonable. For the time that you're here, it should be in alignment with what Cambridge's requirement is for, you know, the time you need to actually spend in Cambridge. It should be in alignment with like requirements your department has already outlined. And so if you say you're going to do field work during your first year, that's not super likely. Like there may be courses you need to take in your department. There are approvals you need to get for field work. And so maybe putting that in your first year doesn't make a lot of sense, but perhaps like delaying that to your second years, but also recognizing that people typically do their field work in their second year is something to keep in mind. To be when we were actually having lockdown, something that would have been helpful for people to have added is a backup plan if, you know, another lockdown happened, so that, you know, they acknowledge, okay, we think lockdown is going to end, you know, before I start my program, but if it comes back, here's how I'll manage, or here's how I'll get the data I need, or here's how I'll be able to conduct those interviews. I think in this context, if there is like particular conflict in the area you're going to, perhaps someone who's, you know, doing research in a place where there's like a war going on, or there might be like natural disasters, then that's something you need to like be thinking about consciously. Next slide. Maybe one more clip. Thank you. And then something that I like to think about questions or like try to anticipate questions that the committee might have for me, but also just questions that help me understand why I'm using the methodology I'm using, and how my methods help me answer my research questions, which help me address the objectives that I originally outlined. And so some of those things are like, what is the purpose of, you know, the interviews, what I hope to gain from them, what questions will I ask in those interviews? If I'm doing archival work, how accessible are the archives? If they're, you know, closed off to people who aren't from the country and I'm not from the country, then what's my plan to kind of navigate that? If they are, I don't know, maybe they've been, you know, burned or there's been some sort of event that's happened that's made these documents less accessible. What's my backup plan? Like, how will I overcome those challenges? And I think you don't have to think about these in hypotheticals. I'm just saying if that is actually the case, then you need to have answers to this. But I don't think you need to say like, oh, if a tornado hits this area, that's a bit too extreme in terms of pre-planning. Are there any resources you need that don't exist or aren't readily available? So for me, I do like research on how like Cambridge Analytica uses like misinformation and other like digital technology tools to influence political elections across the continent. And like my focus is on Kenya and Nigeria. And so, there aren't a lot of resources about like Cambridge Analytica's work. And often the information that is shared is from like whistleblowers. And these are typically people who have been involved with the company, who know a lot of information and decide to be one of the people who shares that data with the public after, people find out that there's been something wild happening with the company. So, maybe I need to interview those people, or I can try to interview people who maybe partnered with the company while they were in like these various countries. But these aren't easily accessible resources. And so I have to like think critically about, how I'll get the interviews, what I'll do if someone doesn't want to interview, what are the resources I can like leverage to be able to paint a full story, so that, I don't have this super cool research topic that I'm interested in and then no data. And now it's just an empty dissertation or a proposal that never gets, fulfilled. And then finally, why is your research important or necessary? Like, what's the impact? Why should someone care about the work you're doing? Why is it important for you to do this work now? What is missing in the scholarly conversation that your work helps to address? What's something someone might have got wrong that you want to correct, or you want to present a different perspective on? Like, all of these things are helpful, because if you're coming into a department and you want to do like research, they need to know why, it's like why they can't say no to your work, essentially. And that's how you're building up your application, as something so exciting or innovative or important that, if they said no, then things will it's feel like that's a very like Chinua thing, like things will fall apart. So thinking about that like very, very critically as well. Like what's the impact? Who are you helping? Are you hoping to influence policy where there'll be direct benefits for the community that you're talking about? Maybe you're doing research in like diabetes and, I don't know, communities in Brazil. And that's like a condition that people are like experiencing at high numbers. And if you can address and understand why, then like there's a massive group of people that you're impacting. That sort of thing is what you should be thinking about. Next slide. Something that people are often nervous about, and I don't want it to come across as scary. Think in general, like if you're doing work, you want credit for your work, right? So we should extend the same to the people whose knowledge and scholarship is contributing to our own work. I like to think of it as what I think in undergrad, they called it like a scholarly conversation. If you're engaging with these other scholars, if you're building on their previous work, if you read their work and it influenced your current work, then it's important to like recognize when that happened, or to acknowledge that has happened by citing them. There are a ton of guidelines out there about how to cite. We listed some like links here as well. But it's just extremely important to kind of like, recognize that especially if you're pulling in direct numbers, direct quotes, theories that, are directly connected to someone else, you need to be able to acknowledge that, but also it'll help you to be intentional about differentiating what is like your own knowledge or contribution from what's already out there. And if you're looking through your proposal and there's like a citation on everything, then that means you likely haven't contributed anything original. And that means you need to go back to the drawing board and actually contribute something original. So it's consider it not only just like just normal policy, but also respect to the other people, but also a check that your work is actually new. Next. Oh, and you should check the last thing I'll say is depending on your discipline, there will be different expectations for what citations look like. And that's something that's one, totally Googleable, but also you can find some assistance on that through these sites as well. Thank you. Next slide. So I think some last tips that apply whether you're doing applying for a PhD at like the business school or engineering or the sciences or humanities or social sciences. You want to customize your research proposal to Cambridge. Why is it important for you to do this research at Cambridge? And just already like emphasized that, even talking about how like the centrifuge that she uses for her research, there's only 4 in this country, and one of those is housed at Cambridge. So that's a big reason why it's important for her to do like her research here. And then for me, for like my work, I look at some things along like artificial intelligence. The Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence is based here at Cambridge. So not only am I attached to my department, but I'm also attached to that like research center. You should also think about what unique resources that this university provides. We talked about the centrifuge. I mentioned the research center. Sometimes other archives. Sometimes it's people who are maybe pioneering in this field, and you need to work directly with them because there aren't people who are doing that same work. Maybe your field is really niche, and there's only maybe a small number of people who actually do research in the area that you do research. And perhaps those people are, or at least one of those people is here at the university. These are good reasons for explaining why at Cambridge. Maybe the department that you're getting into or that you're applying to has a partnership with, an organization that's doing innovative research. Like, think about why Cambridge should say like, oh no, this research needs to be done here and like nowhere else. But also, if you can provide for them these reasons of why you're doing your research here, it shows them that you've done your research. It's one thing for me to say, oh, my work is really important. I'm thinking about like the West and their relationship to like West Africa. But it's another thing for me to say, oh, and this scholar wrote the fundamental books or like theories around this sort of relationship, if that makes sense. They also know that you don't know everything. That's why you're doing the PhD. There are questions you have that you're trying to answer. But I think as long as you can have a clear reason for why you're doing your research here at Cambridge, but also if your proposal is like specific to like the Cambridge community, so like the professors you're working with, the centers you're doing, and perhaps some previous research that's come out of Cambridge, and that's helpful to that's helpful context to include. Avoid obvious mistakes, whether that's incorrect arguments in your proposal, data that's wrong, like spelling errors that could have been fixed through spell check or by rereading it over, having a friend read it over, incomplete thoughts or just incomplete, I guess, arguments for why your research is important, or just not kind of aligning with the guidance that like we've given so far. Like, we're trying to make sure that you all have like holistic applications that are super strong. And so we're giving you this guidance so that you can kind of skip out on the mistakes people make when they don't have this sort of support. So we definitely want you to take advantage of the information we're providing. It's also not something you should rush through. I think I did a couple of iterations of my research proposal. But I was before I was even writing, I was reading up on like my field. And I think when I sat down to do the first like iteration of my proposal, I just sat down at like 10 a.m. And then I read some more, I added in some of the stuff I read. I figured out what the relationship of my research was to some of the other scholars, took a break for lunch, came back. And I think I just gave it an entire day to write a really strong first draft. And then once I did that, I started kind of like sharing it with people, revising it on my own and getting that feedback. But it really took that dedicated time where I was kind of just sitting in like a coffee shop for a full, like way too long, sorting this out. But it was helpful to just sit down, write down all of my ideas, try to write something as strong and cohesive as I could, and then get feedback from other people, but also start to critique it on my own. One of the things that could be helpful is having your mentor, or that you should absolutely do, is have your mentor review your proposal. I think when I was applying to my master's, I might have even had a professor read my research proposal, a professor that I'd already had or that I had a good relationship with, especially if they're in like the same field and they can provide helpful guidance because of their knowledge in that field. And sometimes your proposed supervisor, especially if you've gone by our timeline, you should have already kind of like confirmed this person reached out. They might have even offered to see your proposal ahead of time. And sometimes they'll provide helpful feedback, or maybe, I know one time I sent a proposal to a professor and they were like, oh, actually this other professor, like who's coming back from sabbatical, does work in this same exact area. You should actually work with them. And so sometimes even those sorts of relationships can form, but you should definitely not submit your proposal without having like helpful feedback, without reading through it, and without giving it the adequate time it deserves. Like this is perhaps the most important part of your application. It's the research that you'll be conducting for the next 4 years. So just take your time with it. Next slide. And a few reminders. So I mentioned earlier that you should have already reach out to supervisors and all, but I'll read this list out. So things you should have already done or things you should complete in October. I think I actually messed this up, just but CV and personal statement, like those need to be finalized. Considering all the sources of funding and started like applying to, or started the appropriate application. You should know all the funding that is available to you. Sometimes this Cambridge Trust will update later in the year. You can check back and add those things to your list. But if something is already up, you should have already, sorted out everything you need for it and be drafting or revising your personal statement to apply to those as well. You should already decide on your referees. So the people who will be writing the letters, and they should already be writing those letters. You want to have those done like this month so that it's, one less thing for you to have to concern yourself with. Transcripts should be prepared, especially for those of you who have already finished your previous degrees. If there are no classes that you're currently taking, your transcript should already be uploaded to your application site. For those of you who are still in classes, I don't think you'll have another, unless your transcript will be updated, which I'm trying to think of the academic calendar. I doubt it. You should also already have that uploaded to your site. Deciding on the standardized tests you're taking. So you're taking, you should know what they are. That's something I think we expressed that you should have already looked up before the application even opened, because that's generally available on the site. It's not something the application tells you. So your department or your program site should have already communicated whether a test was required. So like that should already be like checked off your list. And then in terms of like reaching and contacting potential like supervisors, that's something I think we asked you all to start in the summer. Your supervisor ideally should be like, your potential supervisor should ideally be like finalized and also like confirm that they were interested in your application. So that should be kind of something that's put aside as well. Things you want to have complete by the end of November. Your project proposal, your research proposal should be finished. You have already drafted, you've revised, someone's read it, it's done. We're not looking at it anymore. If perhaps the people that you've already reached out to have said no or haven't replied, then sure, you can continue contacting people. But it's not the worst thing if you don't have if you haven't had someone confirm. Usually in the application, they will ask for like your proposed supervisor, like requested, or actually on my research proposal, if I hadn't heard back from someone, I just put like, potential supervisor, so and so and so, and just like put their name, even if they hadn't confirmed with me, because that at least lets them know that you understand who's in your area or who might be a good match, and maybe they'll match with you with that person or someone different. All right, next slide. We are going to shift into the question and answer period. If folks could put their questions in the chat, that's the best way for us to be able to get through them quickly. If you cannot put it in the chat for some reason, feel free to raise your virtual hand, but we prefer you to use the chat if you're able. And I will open the chat.
Oh, I just wanted to mention, so from like the mid-program questionnaire, I don't know whether it applies to this group because it's a small proportion, but like half of the people that filled the form had not signed on to, like had not created an account on the applicant portal. And you need to do that because although we're helping you with the CV, the proposal, and the personal statement, that there could be other things required on your application form depending on your subject. So for example, in engineering PhD, they ask you for the big three, the CV, personal statement, the PhD proposal. They also ask you for a research statement, your career goals, and something else. I don't remember. So you need to apply on the portal to know like what you actually need to finish your application. So that's why it's important that everyone should do that as soon as possible. So you have a better idea of what is actually required. It's good that you do these things. These are the most important, but those are also important as well.
Thank you. And there I'm seeing, okay, people have questions about the word limit for the research proposal and the number of pages. So generally, the first thing I would say is to check your department requirements. Often they will specify how many, like what the word limit is or what the expectation or like range is for the number of words in your proposal. I think in terms of pages, they often actually just put it in terms of words. If your department does not have a word limit, I think my recommendation would be to keep the proposal under 1,500 words. Would you say the same?
Yeah, I think so.
Which I think is about 4 pages.
Yeah, mine last year was 4 pages with references. So
yeah, I would definitely check in on that. If you're keen, you can also reach out to the department to ask specifically if it isn't on their site. Yeah. So I'm trying to look at my department now, but that's a good range. So for the word limit question, I would say 1,500 unless your department says otherwise. And for Chioma, your question, that would be about 4 pages. What's the recommended number of references? Gates Cambridge does not specify a word limit or number of references. So when you indicate that you're interested in applying to Gates, they will actually open up a spot for you to add another reference letter. So Gates technically is just one reference. They review your entire Cambridge application, and then you can add one more reference letter on top of that, in addition to what was it called? Personal statement, or another statement for the scholarship specifically, where you're supposed to essentially make sure that you demonstrate how you meet their like core principles. I'm just trying to double check to make sure that there isn't a word limit, but I'll put that in the chat if I don't see it now. I think actually once you indicate the scholarship, I believe the word limit was like 500 words. That should be about right, but it'll show you on the in your application. So make sure you've indicated that you're interested in Gates, because that way you can start requesting your other reference letter already. How can I decide on the topic for my proposal? What's the recommended word limit for my personal statement? Again, make sure you check your department first for the word limits for your personal statement or your PhD proposal, just because we we want you to take our answer only if they haven't already designated what it should be. I think in terms of personal statement, I think that for me was also 500 words.
I think it's in the application form. So if you log in, it should tell you the maximum. It's either characters or words. So you just need to log into the applicant portal and you find out what the word limit is. Do I have to submit a proposal if I'm applying to get Cambridge scholarship with an MPhil plus PhD course in computational methods in material science?
You'll already have a proposal from that application, so they'll read that. But again, some of the questions y'all have, make sure you check the portal first, because it kind of literally once I clicked, I want to be considered for GATES as well. Then it prompted me to add the additional reference letter. So I knew that I had an extra reference letter. And then it also prompted me to add my GATES Cambridge statement. So I knew that there was a statement on what the limit on that was. So one of the reasons we sent the mid-program progress report form was so that we could see kind of where y'all are at, and everyone should at the very least have started the application and opened it. That way you see what's expected of you and you can submit those things. So on top of the documents that we're talking to you about, there are other just forms that you fill out for the university that are related to just your background, some immigration questions. And you want to be able to make sure that you're spending time just answering those, because those they're not going to take as much work as the rest of your application, but they're important to get right, if that makes sense. Yes. So I actually know someone who did that. The program, the MPhil and PhD course. And yeah, it's the same process as I just outlined. Okay, sorry, not essentially related to today's question, but related on my application. I'm having problems using the Turnitin login. I don't know who posted those. So I would message them directly in the WhatsApp group. I'm hoping people don't have issues with plagiarism on just the general application, because it should just be your own information. And ideally, you're writing your personal statement on your own. You should be writing the PhD statement on your own. You just need to make sure you're citing correctly. But yeah, we didn't post those Turnitin details, so I would directly message the person in the chat who did. I recently got an offer from a faculty who requested I prepare 2 proposals in my area of research, power systems, without giving me specifications. What do you think I do? Vis-a-vis some pages. Secondly, he told me it's a full tuition waiver without a stipend. Should I? We should actually talk about this offline. But to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, so you've already received an offer from your faculty, and I'm assuming you already submitted your application. I'm just a bit confused. So if you email us at the Ask You Mentorship email, the same one we sent this invite from, we can have a longer conversation about that. And then Hannah, can I apply these principles for an MPhil research proposal? Also, is it important to contact a potential supervisor for an MPhil application? You can contact a supervisor for your MPhil application if you know there's someone that you really want to work with, and especially if you want to stay on for the PhD, because that way you can already start a relationship with that person, especially about your research. You can apply a lot of these principles to the MPhil application. The thing I would really focus on is the feasibility, because it's such a short time. So you want to pick a very specific scope with very specific questions that are all feasible within the less than 1 year that you have for it. Yeah. Can we have samples of research proposals in electrical engineering? This will really guide us. I'm trying to think if...
I don't think I found anything on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We could, actually, you can probably find them just like broadly, sorry, on the web. I think so you should kind of start off with your proposal with your own idea. In terms of structuring the research proposal, I think we can find things that you might want to structure it similar to in terms of like how you organize it, like what you start off with first, questions you consider. But it should be like your original like research idea. So if you're looking for, to go back to the earlier question about like how do I decide on the topic for my proposal, the thing I did was I read a lot in my field, and I tried to find the things that were like interesting. Granted, with the amount of time you all have, you might just start with like relatively like narrow and try to find interesting things in the area you're in. See if you could find any kind of gaps. I watched some like YouTube videos about people's research. Yeah. And then I think I stumbled across like one article, and from that article I started branching off, or it was actually a news article even. I started doing focused research on, what was the article? I think I was looking at Cambridge Analytica's like work in the US elections, and I wanted to see if they had done work in other places. And then I realized, oh, there's a bunch of other places, no one's been talking about them though. Okay, let me see what a few of those places were, see where they are geographically. Oh, okay, a lot of them are in the global south, so like South America, South Asia, and the African continent. And I was like, okay, I have the most academic background in the African continent. Let me focus on some countries there. So I was thinking through that sort of logic. So hopefully that is helpful. But we could also share like resources on like formatting the proposal and coming up with your research idea. I'm just going to take a note about that.
I think what I did was just to like Google research proposals, because you're more into the formats and the outline rather than the actual research that they're looking at. So I don't think you necessarily need a research proposal in your field. You could just find a STEM research proposal and see how they outline that methodology and the research plan. And because the context and the like motivation and your research questions won't be the same anyway. So you just need to see how they frame that rather than like what the details were.
Yeah. And also check your department, because there are some departments that like have instructions on how to write a research proposal for them and how they want it formatted.
So
I think it means he thinks you have a good chance at the other scholarships. So it makes sense to go for those. Because like departments don't have a ton of money to fund students, but also in general, people funding at Cambridge, they're always going to tell you to go ask everyone else first. Because if you can get funding there, they could, perhaps divert that funding elsewhere. But also with Gates, Cambridge, and other scholarships, you end up having like other like professional networks. So it's beneficial to still like seek those out, even if you've already like received funding, if that makes sense. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to be like fully double funded. What happens is you take one and then, the other gets sent to someone else later in the summer or like later in the year, after you turn it down. So yeah, apply for Gates, Cambridge, and other scholarships, please. Like anything you're eligible for, apply for it. If you don't get it, it's at least you like put forth like a full effort. If you do get it, like, congrats. I am not seeing other questions. I'll give a few minutes for folks to put in some last minute questions. I'm not seeing any hands up either. I think it takes time to draft review and proposal. The PI gave me 6 days. Well, I told y'all I wrote my proposal in that 10 a.m. and I emailed it at 10 p.m. I would start doing the research for them, and I would like also reach back and ask like, oh, okay, like how many pages are you looking for, and ask for like specifications so that you know like what you need to do. But also, oh, go ahead.
Is there a particular reason why there are two proposals? Is it two different programs?
Good question. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, Chisom, good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, so to respond to your question, is actually it's a single program, the same department. I don't really know why he wants two different research proposals, one in machine learning and one in power systems. So
those are two different labs. So that makes sense now.
I don't actually know if it's actually two different labs, but with his communication to me, he said two research proposals, one machine learning and one power systems.
Is it because it's like a project between those two disciplines?
I'm yet to really understand.
Also, you're proposing your project. It's just that is this a studentship or a?
Yeah, it's a studentship. Yeah, it's a studentship. It's a studentship.
And he has accepted you onto the studentship.
Yeah, but with condition, he said there is full tuition waivers, but no stipend.
What does the condition have to do with the research proposal?
No.
Is it okay? So you can
before you even told me about the research proposal, he already told me that okay, if I'm able to come up with if I agree to the offer of full tuition waivers without stipend.
Well, since the condition doesn't dwell on the research proposal, I can ask him for an extension that he can't do it in 6 days.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I may just do. But he gave 20th of this month, which is next week, Thursday. Today is Thursday, yeah. That's 7 days, yeah.
I mean, you haven't even accepted the offer properly and asking for two proposals. Yeah, if you want to discuss about it, you can email us, but you always have the option of just telling him you can't do it in 6 days.
Yeah. How about the offer? Is it a good offer, kind of? Because the situation now. So
I
also think, I don't know. I am guessing if he's actually testing me or so. I don't know.
Shouldn't be testing you at this stage.
I would just make sure that you still apply to other funding opportunities, because at the end of the day, the best thing is to come out fully funded. And while it's really nice to have tuition covered, because that's more expensive than your living expenses. You want to make sure you're still eligible and open to opportunities that might fund the rest of your degree or the rest of your expenses.
Yeah, I sent him a mail asking him about other opportunities, outside his lab. And so I think it's just to respond. Maybe I will send a reminder again.
Also,
external funding or external.
Yeah, I think, definitely Gates Cambridge and Cambridge Trust and Chevening and everything else. The other, I just lost it. The other thing is, I feel like it's an Oxbridge thing, but people will accept offers, and then when they get a better offer, take that instead. So I wouldn't stress too much about oh, maybe I have to go back later and say no. But we can talk about this more offline too if you have other questions.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And then Hannah.
Okay, thank you so much. I actually typed my question in the chat, but I had issues with my internet, so I don't know if the question has been responded to. So I'm sorry to bring it back. I was asking about if one would need to follow the process that you mentioned for a research proposal for an MPhil application, and also if it's important to reach out to a supervisor when applying for an MPhil degree in any of the social sciences and humanities.
Yeah, I think it doesn't hurt to reach out to a supervisor, especially if you want to do like a PhD program. So that way you can kind of start that like academic relationship early. When it comes to the proposal, I think you can follow similar principles, but recognizing that like field work is like 99 times out of 10 not going to happen because the program is like so much shorter than a PhD. And making sure that your project is feasible to be done within that short period, because you have like classes and you'll have other responsibilities as well on top of like your research. But the ideas of making sure that you have like clear research objectives and that are supported by good research questions and clear methodology, like those are all important. The idea of talking about the skills you already have, you can even mention coursework as well, that prepare you for this research and like this program, that's still important.
Okay, thank you so much.
And then Helen's question, yes, you can submit applications to different departments. Something we talked about in like some of the earlier sessions is some of you will have research that could honestly go either space. So for my research, I look at essentially the history of like Cambridge Analytica's work in data mining and misinformation. So like very digital topics, like in Nigeria and Kenya. And that work could have gone in history and philosophy of science where I am. It could have also been in development studies. It could have also been at the computer lab. And so there are various spaces where the work fits. Put your foot out to all of them. You never know. Some departments accept more students than others. Some departments have different funding opportunities. You don't know, but yeah, put your best foot out there. Thank you for the response so far. Misinformation. What happens if you have reached out to some professors and not gotten a single reply? Are there any other professors you want to reach out to is one question. One of the things we mentioned earlier is that sometimes you don't get a reply from a professor, but you could still put your preferred one on your research proposal. So I think on some of when I was applying to PhD, some of my applications might have just said like potential supervisor is so-and-so. And also sometimes just because you apply to work with a supervisor doesn't even mean you get them. You might be placed elsewhere. So in like one of my cases, I applied to work with one person and they gave my application to another person who was coming back from sabbatical and like actually wasn't on the faculty list, whose work was more related to mine than the original person I applied to work with. So I think as long as you've done, if you've like reached out to people and done like that due diligence, like I think I wouldn't like stress about the fact you haven't gotten a response back. And I think something, sorry, Chisholm, that you were talking about earlier is that it's the beginning of term and everyone's super busy. And so that might be delaying the response as well. So I wouldn't stress it.
But the second part of like changing the topic to suit the recent areas of research, it should suit the areas of research, unless that they have contacted you and said, I'm still happy to like supervise the research, even if it's not, because there are like people that like to do all sorts, and there are people that like to do like a specific field. So you want to kind of still tailor your research proposal to the to the research interests. And like, don't be like so like focused on like what the project is and what the plan is, because it will change. Like the research proposal I submitted, I'm doing like nothing close to that's at the moment. So like it's going to change. You can also change your supervisor. Like it's very flexible once you're in, but like the problem is just getting in. Like once you're in, there's like chaos and can change whatever you want to do. So like it's fine.
Yeah, no, I'm on my second department. My second supervisor, my fourth advisor, like things change. I am not the person I was when I applied at this point.
Yeah.
But you should, yeah, definitely apply with where you are now. Sorry, I missed the part about like the recent areas of research. Yes, especially if you know they have like funding in that area. So like my supervisor usually does like environmental work, but also like work in physics. But he like ran this big project on the histories of AI. That finished actually just before I was coming to Cambridge. And so that's like the thing that we're most connected on now is like a project that he kind of led for like 2 years. There are departments that make providing a supervisor for a PhD optional. Can one go ahead and apply without a potential supervisor? Is it advisable? You can apply without a potential supervisor. We prefer that you kind of reach out and make a connection and have someone who has already like said that they're interested in your research. I think that is helpful because that's someone who's already made it clear that they want to work with you. And I think that's helpful in the process, even if like the supervisor is optional. The one thing I will say is there someone like in your department that you really, really want to work with? And have you contacted them per our timeline? But yeah, to answer your last question, I would advise applying with a potential supervisor that you have made contact with and who has indicated interest. If that has not happened, if no one's indicated interest, then okay, it's optional. You can go forward without it, but yeah. How long should the proposals usually be? I missed that. Will you be giving us a sample structure? I feel what I have needs some good work. Good question. So what we shared earlier is that it shouldn't go over, a few things. One, you should check your department and see if they already have clear guidelines for what your proposal should look like. Some departments will tell you a word limit, but also will tell you the key things to include. And I just use the key things that they said I should include as headings in mind to make sure I addressed everything. And I think I might have added a couple, like 1 or 2 sections as well. When it comes to the sample structure, when it comes to sample structure, we can provide some guidance when we send out the recording of this about like formatting the proposal. But also tips for coming up with the research ideas. I think someone asked about that earlier. So yeah, we can send that within a week, like when we send out the recording for this. Sorry, someone's trying to come in. And then Helen, I'm yet to get a potential supervisor, so I ask. Yeah, if they've already said it's optional and you've already done your due diligence by like, reaching out to supervisors that you would want to work with, I would still put like potential supervisor, that person's name on the application. Because I think it shows, I feel like it's a demonstration that you've, found someone who your work aligns well with. But yeah, again, similar to what I shared with someone earlier, I wouldn't let it stress you. So we have any last questions because we have a firm stop at like 6:25. Sorry, Hannah, did you still have a question or is your hand up from the last one?
Oh, yes, my hand was up from the last time. I
was like, I hope I haven't been ignoring you for like.
It's a mistake.
I have not done a part-time PhD. I think usually people who do that are also like working in the field that they're doing a PhD in. So I've seen it done mainly in education. And so there are people who are actually like currently working in education development or working as teachers that I've met who are doing their PhD part-time. They get a additional time to finish their degree because they're spending more time on it. Because they're going at like half time for it. But I will say, I think it's harder to get funding as a part-time PhD student because a lot of the fellowships require you to be full-time, like Gates is one of those. And I think that would apply to some other fellowships as well. Is there a reason you're thinking part-time?
I know someone at my lab who like works full-time as an engineer and then does part-time PhD. And I'm like, how are you still alive? I can't even handle that. But I also think people do, I also know someone that did part-time PhD and then just part-time random stuff, just like being like part-time job and then part-time PhD. So, but then it's like double the time, 6 to 8 years as well.
So yeah, you can, if you want, you can email us maybe some of the reasons why you're considering part-time. I will say that like there are restrictions on like all of us who are international students, there are restrictions on our visa for like how much we can work. And then Cambridge limits that even more because I think they have a cap at like 10 hours per week. So
Yeah.
ideally, if you're here, it would be like full-time because even, you would only be able to work part-time at like 10 hours, which is
Yeah. I think for visa it's 20 hours.
And then
So,
I think Cambridge like also has like another restriction that
yeah. Oh yeah, visa Cambridge is 10 hours as well.
yeah. So it's all right. Thank you all for coming to the session. We are happy that you all are working along on your PhDs. If you have reached out to supervisors and they have not been responsive, do not fret. It's actually a relatively common thing. We're just glad that you've done that work. If you still want to work with that person and you haven't heard back from them, you can still list them as a potential supervisor or someone you're interested in working with on your application, even if you haven't gotten a confirmation from them. Yeah, we will send a copy of this recording within a week. And also the additional 2 resources that we mentioned. So like coming up with your research idea, but also formatting your research proposal. And I think that's everything. All right. Good night, folks. Let me stop this recording.